Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My wife and I have been together for 8 years now, married for 5. When we first got together, her family was pretty normal. Her mom lived alone in this nice 2-story house, and we'd visit every few weeks for dinner or holidays. Her uncle would show up sometimes, but he mostly kept to himself. He seemed like an okay guy back then, maybe a little quiet, but nothing that raised any red flags. Things started changing about 3 years ago when the pandemic hit. My wife's uncle lost his job at some office downtown. He tried to find work for months, but I guess he never really figured out how to adapt to all the remote work stuff and video interviews. His savings ran out, and he ended up having to move in with my mother-in-law. She's a sweet woman, so of course she said yes when he asked if he could stay, just until he got back on his feet. That was supposed to be temporary. 3 years later, he's still there. At first, it wasn't too bad. He'd stay in his room most of the time when we came over. But gradually, I noticed he started hanging around more when we visited. He'd sit in the living room while we talked, making little comments here and there. Nothing too crazy, just complaints about how kids these days don't know how good they have it, or how, when he was young, children didn't get treats just for existing. My wife and I have 2 kids, a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl. They're good kids, not perfect, but they listen and they're respectful. We visit my mother-in-law every other Saturday because she loves having the grandkids over. She spoils them a little, which is fine by me. That's what grandmas are supposed to do. But her uncle started getting more vocal about everything. If my son asked for a second helping of dessert, the uncle would pipe up about childhood obesity. If my daughter wanted to watch cartoons, he'd start going on about how kids watch too much television these days. If they were playing a little loud, he'd make comments about how children need to be seen and not heard. My wife would give me these looks like she wanted to say something, but it's not our house. Her mom never told him to back off, probably because she felt bad about his situation. So I bit my tongue most of the time. I figured when the kids weren't being directly affected, I could deal with some grumpy old man complaints. The breaking point came this past Thanksgiving. We drove over to my mother-in-law's house around noon. She'd been cooking since early morning and the whole place smelled amazing. The kids were excited because they knew Grandma always made their favorite stuffing and let them help with the mashed potatoes. My wife brought her famous green bean casserole, and I carried in the pumpkin pie we'd picked up from the bakery. Everything started out normal. The kids hugged their grandma, we all sat around the living room catching up, and the uncle was actually being pretty quiet. And I thought maybe we'd get through the day without any drama. We sat down for lunch around 1 o'clock. My mother-in-law had set the table with her good china, and everything looked perfect. The kids were being good, using their napkins, saying please and thank you. We were all just enjoying the meal and talking about school and work. About halfway through eating, my son asked if he could have some soda. We don't usually let the kids have soda with meals at home, but it was Thanksgiving, and my mother-in-law had bought some of those little cans of ginger ale, specifically for the grandkids. I was reaching for the can when the uncle decided to open his mouth. He announced loudly that my son didn't need soda at lunch. I paused for a second, thinking I might have misheard him. But he was looking right at my son with this stern expression, like he was the one in charge here. I cracked open the soda can and handed it to my boy. The fizzing sound seemed really loud in the suddenly quiet room. The uncle repeated himself, saying again that my son didn't need any soda. That's when something inside me snapped. This man had been pushing boundaries for months, making little comments about my parenting, acting like he had some authority over my children. But this was different. This was him directly contradicting me in front of my kids. I looked him straight in the eyes and used his full legal name. Not just his first name, but his complete government name, middle name, and all. I used what my wife calls my dad voice, the tone that makes my kids stop whatever they're doing and pay attention immediately. I told him he needed to stop talking right now. The reaction was immediate. My kids went completely still, like they always do when they hear that voice. My wife's eyes went wide and she froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. My mother-in-law actually jumped a little in her chair, but the uncle, he looked like someone had just slapped him across the face. He opened his mouth like he was going to argue back, but I wasn't having it. I cut him off before he could get a word out, telling him nope, zip it, and that this wasn't a conversation. I used his full name again for emphasis. The man actually stuttered. He tried to get words out, but nothing coherent came. Finally, he managed to stammer something about how his mom was the last person to call him by his full name like that. That just made me angrier. I told him maybe she should have done it more often and that we were done talking about it. The rest of the meal was pretty quiet. My son drank his soda without any more commentary from the peanut gallery. The uncle excused himself right after we finished eating and disappeared upstairs. My mother-in-law looked a little shaken, but she didn't say anything about it. Later, while we were cleaning up, my wife pulled me aside. She said she couldn't believe I had done that. I told her someone had to because he'd been testing boundaries for months. She agreed but said using his full name like that was intense because he looked like he was going to cry. I said good, maybe now he'd remember that he's not the parent here, and I am. My mother-in-law overheard us talking and came over. She apologized for what happened and explained that her brother had been having a hard time since he moved in. She thought he felt like he didn't have control over anything in his life anymore. I told her I understood that, but he didn't get to take that out on my kids or undermine my parenting. I said if he wanted control over something, he could start by controlling his mouth. She nodded and didn't argue. I think she knew I was right, even if she felt sorry for her brother. The uncle stayed upstairs for the rest of our visit. When we were leaving, my mother-in-law walked us to the car. She promised she would talk to him and that this wouldn't happen again. I told her I hoped not because next time I wouldn't be so polite about it. We haven't been back since Thanksgiving, but my wife talks to her mom on the phone regularly. According to my mother-in-law, the uncle has been much quieter lately. Apparently, he asked her if we were mad at him and whether we'd still come for Christmas. My wife wants me to let it go and act like nothing happened when we see him next. But honestly, I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet. He crossed a line and he needed to be reminded that my kids have parents who are perfectly capable of making decisions for them. I met my boyfriend through mutual friends about 2 years ago, and we started dating 6 months back. When his birthday came around, I wanted to give him something special instead of just buying a regular gift. I spent several evenings making him a small scrapbook with photos of us together, ticket stubs from movies and events we went to, and little handwritten notes about our memories. It wasn't expensive or fancy, but I thought it would mean something to him. When I gave it to him on his birthday, he seemed really happy. He told me he loved it, thanked me for putting so much thought into it. He placed it on his bookshelf in his living room, and I felt good about the whole thing. A few days later, we were hanging out at his place with some of his friends. We'd all been drinking and were talking about random stuff when someone brought up his birthday and what gifts he got. That's when my boyfriend started describing my scrapbook to everyone. The way he talked about it made my stomach sink. He kept calling it middle school relationship core and laughing about how I'd included things like movie ticket stubs and handwritten notes. His friends started laughing too, and he seemed to enjoy the attention. One friend asked if I'd really written him little love notes, and my boyfriend said yes while chuckling. He described how I'd written things like, "Remember when we got caught in the rain," with little smiley faces. He said it was so innocent in a way that made it sound silly and childish. Another friend said it sounded kind of sweet, but my boyfriend just shrugged and said it was like something a 13-year-old would make for their first boyfriend. I sat there smiling and laughing along because I didn't know what else to do. Inside, I felt completely embarrassed and hurt. Here I was thinking I'd done something meaningful, and he was treating it like a joke for his friends' entertainment. I managed to get through the rest of the evening without saying anything, but I cried the whole way home. The next morning, I went back to his apartment while he was at work. I took the scrapbook from his shelf and threw it in the dumpster behind his building. Maybe it was petty, but seeing it there just reminded me of how stupid I'd felt the night before. A couple of days passed before he noticed it was missing. He asked where the scrapbook had gone. When I told him I'd thrown it away, he wanted to know why I would do that. I explained that he'd made it pretty clear he thought it was childish and embarrassing. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging that his comments had hurt me, he got angry. He told me I was being way too dramatic and that it had just been a joke. He said I always take things too personally and that it's exhausting. He claimed he couldn't say anything without me getting offended. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to be difficult and that it had just hurt when he made fun of something I'd put effort into. He said he hadn't been making fun of it and that he was just being honest about what it was. Then he told me that by throwing it away like some kind of tantrum, I'd made him look like the bad guy. He was acting like I was the problem for having feelings about the whole thing. I told him I wasn't trying to make him look bad, and that I just didn't want to keep looking at something that reminded me of feeling embarrassed. He said, "Congratulations." Now he felt terrible because his girlfriend couldn't take a simple joke. He claimed I'd turned it into a huge issue when it didn't need to be. When I asked how this was my fault, he explained that we'd all been tipsy and it wasn't that serious. He said that instead of just telling him it bothered me right away, I'd gone nuclear and thrown the whole thing away. According to him, that wasn't normal behavior. The more we talked, the more frustrated he became. He kept saying that I was overreacting and that throwing away the scrapbook was an extreme response. He told me I should have just said something immediately instead of being passive-aggressive about it. Then he tried a different approach. He said he was sorry if his comments came across wrong and offered to take me out to dinner to make up for it. I thought maybe we were getting somewhere, but then he added that I had to admit throwing it away was taking things too far. He said I'd made him feel terrible for no reason. I reminded him that there was a reason and that he'd called something I made for him childish in front of his friends. He argued that he hadn't called it childish and that he'd just said it was like middle school relationship core. He claimed there was a difference. When I asked how that was different, he explained that he wasn't insulting it but just describing the vibe. He told me I was reading way too much into everything he said. At this point, I realized he wasn't actually sorry about what he'd said. He was sorry that I'd reacted to it. He wanted me to apologize for throwing away the scrapbook and making him feel bad, but he didn't want to take responsibility for why I'd felt the need to throw it away in the first place. The worst part was how he kept acting like I was being unreasonable for having hurt feelings. Every time I tried to explain why his comments had bothered me, he'd interrupt to tell me I was being too sensitive or taking things the wrong way. He told me this was exactly what he was talking about and that I always did this. He said something small would happen and I'd blow it up into this big emotional thing. When I said it wasn't small to me when he mocked something I'd spent time making for him, he said again that he hadn't mocked it. He added that even if he had, adults talk about these things instead of just throwing stuff away like children. The whole conversation went in circles. He'd apologize for hurting my feelings, then immediately follow it up with explanations for why my feelings were wrong or my reaction was inappropriate. He wanted credit for the apology without actually taking responsibility for what he'd done. I realized there was no point in continuing the discussion. He'd decided that I was the problem, and nothing I said was going to change his mind. The relationship didn't last much longer after that. Turns out someone who thinks your feelings are too much and treats your efforts like jokes isn't really relationship material. His friends probably got a good laugh out of that story too. I saved up for years to buy my first house. The place needed some work, but it had a perfect south-facing roof for solar panels. I had been researching renewable energy and knew I wanted to install them once I became a homeowner. The installation took 3 weeks with a local company that had great reviews. The panels looked modern on my roof, and my electricity bills dropped right away. Most of my neighbors were curious and supportive when they asked about them. Karen lived 2 houses down and hated the panels from day one. She said they were ugly and would hurt property values. She came to my door the day after installation and told me to remove them because they reflected light into her bedroom window in the morning. She said those ugly things were ruining the neighborhood and asked if I knew how much glare they made. I told her they were positioned to minimize reflection, and the installer followed all guidelines. I suggested she could adjust her blinds. Karen got mad and said she shouldn't have to change anything in her home because of my selfish choices. She left angry, but that wasn't the end. Over the next few weeks, she left notes in my mailbox about being considerate and thinking before making big changes. I tried to ignore her, thinking she would get used to the panels. Things got worse when Karen started calling the city about supposed code violations. An inspector came out twice, but both times everything checked out perfectly. The panels were properly permitted and professionally installed. Each time the inspector left without finding problems, Karen would stare at me from her yard like it was my fault her complaints were wrong. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when I was out running errands. I went to the hardware store for garden supplies and stopped for groceries too. The whole trip took about 2 hours. When I pulled into my driveway, I heard screaming from above. I looked up and saw Karen on my roof, standing right on my solar panels. Blood was dripping from her foot, and she was yelling loudly. I asked what she was doing up there, and how she got on my roof. She screamed for help and said she was hurt. Then she blamed me for everything. I could see a ladder leaning against my house. She had dragged it over and climbed onto my roof. Solar panels aren't made to be walked on, and one of the edges cut her foot when she stepped wrong. I called emergency services right away, asking for both police and paramedics. While we waited, Karen kept yelling that I was responsible for her injury and she would sue me for everything. Karen said I put death traps on my roof and anyone could get hurt. I reminded her she was trespassing and asked why she was even up there. She said she was trying to see if the panels were legal and someone needed to check them. Her explanation made no sense. She had broken onto my property, climbed onto my roof without permission, damaged my solar panels by walking on them, hurt herself, and was now blaming me for her own actions. The paramedics arrived first and had to bring their own ladder to get her down safely. She kept ranting about how I should pay her medical bills and how dangerous my panels were. The EMTs tried not to roll their eyes while bandaging her foot. When police officers arrived, Karen immediately started her version of events. She told the officer I had dangerous equipment on my roof that hurt her. She said she was just trying to make sure everything was safe for the neighborhood and got cut because I didn't secure the panels right. I explained she had trespassed on my property and climbed onto my roof without permission. I made clear I wasn't even home when this happened. The officers took statements from both of us. I explained I had been out running errands all morning. Karen stuck to her story that she was investigating for neighborhood safety and I was liable for her injuries since they happened on my property. One officer examined the roof and panels while his partner took more statements. He said the panels weren't damaged beyond some scuff marks from Karen's shoes. Her injury was clearly from stepping on a sharp edge while walking where she shouldn't have been. Just when it seemed like the situation might end with just a trespassing warning, my neighbor from across the street walked over. He had been watching from his window and had something important to add. The neighbor told the officers he saw the whole thing happen. He said he was having morning coffee when he noticed her dragging that ladder across the yard. She definitely looked around to make sure no one was watching before setting it up and climbing up. He said she was being really sneaky about it. This changed everything. The neighbor explained he watched Karen wait until my car was gone, then get the ladder and carefully position it against my house. He said she looked around multiple times to make sure she wasn't being seen before climbing up. He told officers she spent a good 5 minutes making sure the coast was clear. He made clear this wasn't some accident or safety inspection and she knew exactly what she was doing. Karen's face went white as her story fell apart. The officers asked her directly about the neighbor's account and she started stuttering and changing her story. She said she was just concerned about the neighborhood and thought maybe if she could get a closer look it would help. The officer told her what she was describing was criminal trespassing and destruction of property. He explained she had gone onto someone else's roof without permission on purpose. The paramedics finished treating Karen's foot and said she needed stitches but it wasn't serious. They loaded her into the ambulance, but one officer rode along to make sure she didn't leave before they could process her arrest. The other officer stayed to finish paperwork and get the neighbor's official statement as a witness. He told me I wouldn't be liable for Karen's injuries since she was trespassing when they happened. The officer explained my panels were perfectly legal and properly installed. He said she hurt herself while committing a crime on my property. He even mentioned I could probably press charges for the damage to my panels. After everyone left, I sat in my living room trying to process what happened. Karen had been so sure she was right that she actually broke into my property to try to prove some point about my solar panels. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempt to find problems with my panels resulted in her getting hurt entirely due to her own illegal actions. Later that afternoon, the neighbor who witnessed everything stopped by to check on me. He said he had been dealing with Karen's complaints about various neighbors for years, but this was the first time she actually committed a crime over her complaints. A week later, Karen had been charged with criminal trespassing and would have to pay for the minor damage to my solar panels. Her lawyer apparently told her that any attempt to sue me would be thrown out immediately since she was injured while breaking the law on my property. I teach computer science at a local university, and this semester I had to deal with one of the most entitled students I've ever encountered. The whole mess started during my advanced programming module, which is designed to prepare students for real-world software development work. The module centers around a group programming project where students collaborate to build a functional application. It's not rocket science, but it mirrors what they'll actually do in the tech industry. Students work in teams of 4, tackle different components, integrate their code, and present a working product. Half the grade comes from individual coding skills, and the other half evaluates teamwork, communication, and collaborative problem solving. I've been teaching this course for several years, and most students understand the value of learning to work with others. After all, software development is rarely a solo endeavor in professional settings. But this one student was different from day one. Let me call him Kevin. Kevin had this habit of submitting code that looked impressive at first glance but fell apart under scrutiny. The syntax was perfect. The structure seemed sophisticated. But when I asked him to explain his logic or walk through his algorithms, he'd fumble through vague explanations that made no sense. It was obvious he was using artificial intelligence tools to generate most of his work, then submitting it without understanding what the code actually did. During our first individual consultation, I pulled up one of his assignments on my computer and asked him to walk me through how a complex function worked. Kevin gave me some nonsense answer about the data being sorted using the most efficient method. When I pressed him for specifics about which sorting method it was using, he just said it was the best one for this type of data. I pointed out that his code was actually using a bubble sort implementation, which is one of the least efficient sorting methods for large datasets, and asked why he chose this approach. He claimed he had researched different options, and this seemed like the right choice. It was painful to watch. The code he'd submitted used advanced optimization techniques that a student at his level shouldn't even know about, yet he couldn't explain the most basic components. I started leaving detailed feedback on his assignments, pointing out these inconsistencies and strongly suggesting he focus on understanding fundamental concepts rather than submitting overly complex solutions he clearly didn't write himself. Kevin always pushed back against my feedback. He'd send emails arguing that his code worked perfectly and questioning my evaluation methods. He seemed genuinely offended that I expected him to understand the code he was submitting. When I announced the group project assignments, I carefully balanced each team to include students with different strengths. Kevin's group consisted of 3 other solid students who I thought might help bring him up to speed. That's when the real problem started. 3 weeks into the project, Kevin approached me after class with a demand that caught me completely off guard. He told me he needed to work on the project alone because he couldn't work with the other people in his group. I asked him what he meant by that, and he repeated that he needed to do the entire project by himself. I explained that this was specifically designed to be a collaborative exercise, that the learning objectives required him to work with teammates, coordinate efforts, and integrate different components. I told him I couldn't excuse him from the group work. Kevin argued that he worked better alone and that group projects were just an excuse for lazy students to coast on other people's work. I reminded him that group collaboration was worth 50% of his grade, and if he didn't participate in team activities, he'd automatically lose half his points before I even looked at his code. Kevin complained that this was unfair and that I should grade based on the quality of work, not whether someone played nice with others. I tried explaining that software development in the real world requires constant collaboration, that even brilliant programmers need to work effectively with designers, project managers, and other developers. Kevin wasn't having it. He told me he wasn't paying tuition to babysit other students and demanded that I either let him work alone or he'd file a complaint with the department head. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let him attempt the project solo, but I made sure he understood the results. I sent him detailed written feedback explaining that he'd lose all group collaboration points and would need to demonstrate much higher individual performance to compensate. I documented everything in emails with read receipts, knowing the situation might escalate later. Every week during our group check-ins, I'd see Kevin's former teammates working together effectively while he sat alone in the corner, typing away on his laptop. The other students in his original group actually seemed relieved to work without him. When I asked them about it privately, they told me Kevin had been dismissive and condescending from the start. One of his former teammates told me during office hours that Kevin kept telling them their ideas were stupid and that he could build something much better on his own. When they tried to divide up the tasks, he said he didn't trust them to write code that met his standards. Throughout the semester, I continued sending Kevin feedback about his isolated approach. I warned him repeatedly that working alone put his grade at serious risk, especially since the project requirements specifically called for integrated components that would be difficult for one person to complete effectively. Kevin brushed off my concerns, insisting he didn't need other people slowing him down. He was confident that his project would be better than anything the groups produced. The final submission deadline arrived and I collected projects from all the groups. Kevin's former teammates had built an impressive inventory management system with a clean user interface, robust database integration, and comprehensive testing protocols. Their code was well documented and clearly showed different programming styles working together cohesively. Then I opened Kevin's submission. The first red flag was immediately obvious. The project requirements called for a customer relationship management system with specific features like contact tracking, sales pipeline management, and reporting tools. Kevin had submitted what appeared to be a social media analytics platform. It wasn't even close to what we'd asked for. I started examining his code more closely. The structure looked sophisticated on the surface, with elaborate frameworks and advanced design patterns that seemed impressive. But when I tried to run the application, nothing worked properly. The database connections failed, the user interface was broken, and most of the advanced features were just empty functions with no actual implementation. It was obvious that Kevin had cobbled together code from various artificial intelligence tools without understanding how the pieces fit together. He'd essentially created an elaborate house of cards that looked impressive but had no solid foundation. Since his code deviated so dramatically from the specifications and appeared to be largely non-functional, I scheduled a viva voce examination. This is an oral defense where students explain their work in detail, proving they understand what they've built. Kevin arrived for his viva with his usual confident attitude. I started by asking him to explain the overall architecture and how his system handled user authentication. Kevin gave me some vague response about using industry-standard security protocols to ensure data protection. When I asked which protocol specifically, he said he was using the most secure ones available. I told him I needed him to walk me through the actual code and show me where user passwords were validated. Kevin stared at his screen for several long seconds, clicking through files randomly. He claimed the security was handled in the back-end modules. I pointed to a specific function that was supposed to validate login credentials and asked him to explain how it worked. Kevin said it checked if the user information matched the database. I had to point out that the function just returned true for any input and didn't actually check anything. Kevin claimed that was probably a temporary implementation and that the real security would be added later. The entire examination continued like this. Kevin couldn't explain any meaningful aspect of his code. When I asked about specific algorithms, he gave generic responses. When I pointed out obvious bugs, he claimed they were intentional design choices. When I asked him to modify a simple function, He had no idea where to begin. After 45 minutes of painful questioning, it was clear that Kevin had submitted work he didn't understand and couldn't defend. Combined with his failure to meet the basic project requirements and his complete absence of group collaboration points, his final grade was a spectacular failure. Kevin protested that this was completely unfair and that his code was more advanced than anything the other groups had submitted. I explained that his code didn't work and he couldn't explain how any of it functioned. More importantly, he had ignored the project specifications entirely. Kevin accused me of being biased against students who think independently. I handed him the official failure notice, which meant he'd need to repeat the entire module next semester. Kevin walked out angrily, talking about filing complaints and demanding a different instructor. The one downside to this whole situation? When Kevin retakes the module next semester, he'll be back in my class again. But at least now I know exactly what I'm dealing with. I started working in the sterile processing department at our Level 1 trauma center about 6 months ago. The department handles all the cleaning and sterilization of surgical instruments that get reused throughout the hospital. We're the backbone that keeps everything running, though most people don't even know we exist. The job came with some downsides. We had to work weekends and holidays since the hospital never closes. But I didn't mind picking up the holiday shifts since I got double time and a half, and honestly, I didn't have much else going on anyway. My social life had taken a hit after my last relationship ended, so working extra hours helped fill the time in my bank account. That weekend started like any other. Emergency surgeries were coming down from the emergency room throughout the day, which meant we stayed busy processing instruments for the operating rooms. I had just finished my break and was walking back from the cafeteria when everything went sideways. The route back to my department took me past the family consultation rooms where relatives waited for updates on their loved ones. I had my earbuds in, listening to some seriously loud punk rock to help me power through the rest of my shift. That's probably why I didn't immediately notice the man who came rushing out of one of the rooms. He looked frantic and started waving his arms to get my attention. I pulled out my earbuds and stopped walking. I asked if I could help him. He told me he wanted to know where his wife was. She had been in surgery for over an hour and he hadn't heard anything. I could see the stress written all over his face, and I felt bad for him. But there wasn't anything I could do to help. I said I wasn't sure, and that they would come get him when they had news. He got louder and asked why I couldn't tell him anything. I tried to explain that I didn't even work in the operating room. I said I didn't know who he or his wife was, and even if I did, I wouldn't be allowed to share patient information anyway. He cut me off before I could finish explaining and started shouting. He told me his wife's name was Sarah and demanded I go find out an update now. His voice was getting louder and more demanding. I could understand being worried, but this was heading in the wrong direction fast. I told him not to raise his voice at me. I said I didn't work in the operating room and couldn't help him. He pointed at my scrubs and said I did work there because I was wearing the same uniform. He was right about the scrubs. Everyone who worked in sterile processing wore the same surgical scrubs as the operating room staff. It was a hospital policy to prevent contamination, but that didn't make me a surgeon or a nurse. I explained that I worked in sterile processing and had to get back to work. I turned to walk away, figuring the conversation was over. That's when I felt his hand clamp down on my arm like a vice grip. The guy grabbed me and started trying to tell me not to walk away from him. I lost it. I yelled at him to get his hand off of me. I yanked my arm away and spun around to face him. My heart was pounding and adrenaline was flooding my system. This stranger had just put his hands on me, and I was ready to defend myself if I had to. We started shouting at each other in the middle of the hallway. I don't remember everything that was said because I was so amped up, but I know it got heated fast. That's when one of the operating room nurses came around the corner. She took one look at what was happening and immediately ran back the way she came. Within what felt like seconds, she returned with several security officers in tow. The officers quickly stepped between us and managed to create some space. They separated us into different consultation rooms while they figured out what had happened. A security officer asked me to tell him what happened. I explained the whole situation from the beginning, how he had stopped me, asking for information about his wife, how I had told him I couldn't help because I didn't work in the operating room, and how he had grabbed my arm when I tried to leave. I said I understood he was stressed about his wife, but he had no right to put his hands on me. The security officer agreed that no one had the right to touch me without permission, regardless of the circumstances. While I was giving my statement, I could hear the man shouting from the other room. His voice was muffled through the walls, but it was clear he was still agitated and making a scene. After I finished explaining everything, one of the officers stepped out to coordinate with his colleagues. When he came back, he told me I was free to return to my department. He said I would need to fill out an incident report, but I could head back to work now. When I walked out of the consultation room, I saw them escorting the man down the hallway in handcuffs. He was still talking loudly, but his hands were secured behind his back. The whole situation had escalated so quickly from a simple misunderstanding to someone getting arrested. When I got back to my department, I found my charge person and explained what had happened. She asked if I was okay and offered to let me take the rest of the day off. I said I was fine, just a little shaken up, but needed to fill out an incident report. She told me to take my time with it and make sure I included everything. When I sat down to write up the incident report, I started thinking about how common this probably was for healthcare workers who dealt directly with patients and families. Working in sterile processing, I was usually insulated from these kinds of confrontations. The stress of having a loved one in surgery must be overwhelming, but that didn't excuse putting hands on someone who was just trying to do their job. I wasn't a doctor or nurse who could provide updates on his wife's condition. I was just trying to get back to work so I could keep the instruments clean and sterile for whatever surgery she was having. The whole experience left me rattled for the rest of my shift. Every time someone walked past our department, I found myself looking up to make sure it wasn't another upset family member looking for answers I couldn't provide. Later that evening, the man's wife had come through surgery just fine. She woke up to find out that her husband had been arrested for assaulting a hospital employee while she was under anesthesia. That had to be devastating news to receive while recovering from surgery. Part of me felt bad for both of them, but mostly I was just glad the situation hadn't escalated further. If that nurse hadn't come around the corner when she did, things could have gotten much worse. The man clearly wasn't thinking straight, and I was ready to fight back if he had escalated things further. The incident report got filed, and I never heard anything more about it. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.